Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us both in person and virtually. My name is Paul Newman, the Museum Collections and Operations Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Lunch by Object Talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing changing exhibits, and other historical programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Today's Lunch Bite features Andrew Outten discussing a portrait of Revolutionary War veteran Andrew Wallace. This portrait, which features in our current exhibition, Fete Lafayette, which marks the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's farewell tour of the United States. Andrew is the Institute's Historical Program Manager, having joined our team in 2021. Prior to that, he spent 9 years as the Director of Education and Museum Services for the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates in Chadds Pennsylvania. Here at the Institute, Andrew develops our historical programs, ranging from lunch bites and lectures like these to battlefield tours and other special programs. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Andrew Outten.
Thank you, Paul. Now, I do have three descendants of William Wallace, or Andrew Wallace, or two descendants in the front row, and the owner of the painting is online watching, so the pressure is on to deliver today. Before I start, I'd just like to preface the lunch bite with a story to kick things off. On a cold and snowy December night in 1829, artist John Nagel was walking to a friend's home in Philadelphia. During his walk in the chilling temperatures, he came across an elderly and tattered man attempting to keep warm under a dilapidated structure. The charitable Nagel approached the man, who he later recalled as being, quote, much benumbed with cold and scantily clad, to inquire about his well-being before inviting the man into his home and out of the cold. The elderly and tattered man was German immigrant Joseph Winter, who barely spoke English. After employing his grocer as a translator, Nagel soon learned that Winter was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. After listening to Winter's story, Nagel came to the realization that Winter would be, quote, a noble subject for the pencil, and invited the veteran to remain in his home. Nagel painted Winter's portrait that evening before giving him clothing and a bed for an additional night, and Winter departed for Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 2 days later. Just over a year later, in January of 1831, a well-known British engraver, John Sartain, arrived in Philadelphia. Nagel approached Sartain and offered his portrait of Winter for him for reproduction in mezzotint. Sartain accepted Nagel's offer, produced an engraving of Winter, and entitled it Patriotism and Age. The engraving was published at a time when debates over pension reform for Revolutionary War veterans were at their height, and where many were advocating for their benefit. The engraving of Winter, depicted as an elderly and neglected veteran, quickly became an advocacy tool for this purpose. Like Sartain, John Nagel was also an advocate for veterans, and although his encounter with Winter occurred by chance, he was inspired to make further use of his artistic influence. Just a month after Sartain's Patriotism and Age was published, Nagel was approached by another friend, Major James Nelson Barker, who was a playwright, politician, and a veteran of the War of 1812. Barker was working on a biographical piece to highlight the service of another Revolutionary War veteran, the 101-year-old Sergeant Andrew Wallace, who Barker asked Nagel to paint as an illustrative accompaniment to his written piece. On March 9th, 1831, Nagel penned to his friend, quote, I assure you that I feel, as an American, too grateful for those brave fellows who shed their blood in securing the liberties of our now happy country. I will, with pleasure, paint his portrait, that it may accompany your biographical sketch of him, so that he may reap a pecuniary advantage from its publication. Wallace sat for Nagel soon after. The portrait only took 5 hours, but Nagel recalled the occasion in his scrapbook. He noted that Wallace, quote, served in Braddock's defeat when fighting against the Indians in 1756 and against the English in 1776 to the peace. He went on to note some non-military feats of Wallace, by saying, Andrew now has his 6th wife and is the father of 34 children, the last of whom would be at this time 9 years old. And that the 100-year-old Wallace was apparently agile enough to, quote, spring a gutter with considerable energy. Nagel's portrait of Wallace was deemed by one contemporary as, quote, one of Nagel's best works. And like his portrait of Joseph Winter, Nagel envisioned Wallace's portrait as a tool to advocate for better pensions and treatment towards Revolutionary War veterans. For unknown reasons, Barker's piece about Wallace was never written, and Nagel's portrait of him didn't get the same attention as his portrait of Winter. Aside from occasionally lending it to friends and students, the portrait remained in Nagel's personal collection until it was finally exhibited in 1841. But even after that, it continued to receive little attention. For by then, the debates surrounding pensions for Revolutionary War veterans had subsided, and the portrait really no longer served its intended purpose. Nagel's portrait of Andrew Wallace now hangs in our current exhibition, Fete Lafayette, a French hero's tour of the American Republic, after being generously loaned by Mr. and Mrs. William Marshall of the Society of the Cincinnati in the state of South Carolina. In the portrait, one can see the elderly Wallace dressed in a jacket, vest, and a black cravat around his neck, while his gloved hands rest on a walking stick. He sits erect while gazing at the viewer with tired but focused eyes. Andrew Wallace was a character, to say the least, and I'm sure his descendants can attest to that. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, he became a celebrity figure for his military service throughout the Revolution, all of which was listed and submitted to the War Department in 1833 when he applied for his Revolutionary War pension. Not only was he the subject of Nagel's portrait, but he was also depicted in various lithographs and was feted at various public appearances in the later years of his life. So who was Andrew Wallace? Why was he such a revered person? What is the significance of his portrait, and why is it hanging in an exhibition highlighting the Marquis de Lafayette's tour in 1824 and 1825? These are the questions I intend to answer today. So let's begin by learning a little bit more about the portrait's subject. Andrew Wallace was born in Inverness, Scotland in 1730, and for nearly 30 years of his life, he served as a soldier. His first military experiences occurred at the Battle of Prestonpans in Culloden in 1745 against the English crown when he was just 15 years old. After emigrating to Ireland for a short time, he emigrated and settled in America in 1752, and 3 years later served during the French and Indian War by participating in Braddock's defeat in 1755. When war broke out with Great Britain, Wallace enlisted in the Continental Army in 1776 at Turk's Head, now modern-day Westchester, in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and served as a sergeant in the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment until the war's end. His first combat in the war came at the Battle of Three Rivers in 1776, before he later crossed the Delaware with Washington in December of 1776. Evidently, he suffered such severe frostbite during that crossing that his hands never fully recovered from the experience. In 1777, he participated in the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, the Paoli Massacre on September 20th, and the Battle of Germantown on October 4th. He was with the Army at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 78, before participating in the Battle of Monmouth on June 28th, 1778, and later the storming of Stony Point in 1779. Subsequently, he was then sent south and participated in the war's southern campaign, where he participated in the Battle of Camden in 1780 and the battles of Cowpens on January 17th, Eutaw Springs on September 8th, and the Siege of Yorktown while serving in Colonel William Washington's cavalry troop. One of the more notable aspects of his Revolutionary War career, though, came at the Battle of Brandywine, where he aided the Marquis de Lafayette on the battlefield after the Frenchman was wounded. Following the Revolution, Wallace had an actual shocking experience when he was struck by lightning while, quote, attending to a cannon during a 4th of July celebration, which put him in a coma for 17 days before he woke up with no permanent injuries or ailments. A bolt of lightning didn't prevent Wallace from re-entering military service, though, as he later served at St. Clair's defeat, also known as the Battle of Wabash in 1791, and the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. He later continued to serve in the Army at different intervals until 1813, when he was discharged on account of disability at the age of 83 in New Orleans. So with such an incredible and impressive career, one might call Andrew Wallace the Forrest Gump of his time. And it is easy to understand why and how he obtained his celebrity status towards the end of his life. But sometimes when we hear a story that's too good to be true, it isn't. I suppose now is a good time to confess that the majority of what I just read for you about Wallace isn't true. Everything from that biography was either claimed by Wallace himself or came from contemporary sources highlighting him, and they all must be viewed with the utmost skepticism. This is how Americans in the 1820s and 1830s saw the man in Nagel's portrait, though, and he became a phenomenon because of it. Using military records, primarily the muster rolls of the 5th Pennsylvania, let's now dig in and examine what Wallace's experience in the Revolution really entailed. The first record of Wallace's service in the Revolution can be found on a muster roll of the 5th Pennsylvania dated September 6, 1777. It indicates that he actually enlisted with the regiment on September 1st as a private. There is no record of any military service for him in the Continental Army or the militia prior to this date. There is also no record of him serving at the Battle of Three Rivers or crossing the Delaware with Washington in 1776. From all indications, Wallace's first combat experience would have been at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 10 days after his enlistment. Following Brandywine, Wallace did participate in the battles of Paoli and Germantown and was with the army at Valley Forge. It was there on February 11, 1778, that Wallace was evidently appointed as a fifer and drummer, and the muster rolls indicate that he served in this capacity until August of 1778, shortly after he served at the Battle of Monmouth, when he was, quote, reduced to the ranks. Muster rolls also indicate that he was with the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment at the Middlebrook encampment in New Jersey throughout the winter of 1778 and 79, the Smith's Clove and West Point encampments in New York during the summer of 79, and the Morristown encampment in New Jersey throughout the winter and spring of 1779 and 1780. The last record of Wallace's military service during the Revolution can be found on the 5th Pennsylvania's muster roll from September 1st, 1780, that combined the 3 preceding months of June, July, and August after the Pennsylvania line's departure from the Morristown encampment. It is known that the Pennsylvania line returned to Morristown for the winter that November, so we can assume that Wallace was also there. Aside from his last listing in the muster roll dated September of 1780, the only other record relating to Wallace's service in the Revolution can be found in a record book from 1784 under the following heading. Quote, we and each of us whose names here unto subscribed do acknowledge to have received the several sums opposite to our names, respectively, in certificates dated July 1st, 1784, bearing interest at 6% from January 1st, 1781, being the balance of a settlement between the United States and us for pay to January 1st, 1781. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Pennsylvania Line's history during the Revolution, January 1st, 1781 is a very significant date, as it is when the Pennsylvania Line staged a mutiny because their demands for pay and better provisions were not met. The mutiny was carried out by all the regiments within the Pennsylvania Line, but not initially. At its outset, the soldiers of the 5th and 9th Pennsylvania regiments heeded their officers' orders and resisted. It was only when the rest of the Pennsylvania mutineers allegedly turned and fired a cannon over their heads that they decided to join. Following the events of January 1st, the Pennsylvania Line was furloughed until March and restructured shortly after. Though historians also they indicate that although the 5th Pennsylvania was one of the 6 Pennsylvania regiments retained on the Army's roll after the mutiny, most of its men were discharged. With the listing of Wallace's name in the 1784 record book and being paid through January 1st, 1781, the fact that most of the soldiers were subsequently discharged following the massive furlough, and the trail of records for Wallace going completely cold after he was meticulously listed on the muster rolls for over 2 years, it is highly probable that he was sent home after the mutiny in 1781. If Wallace did remain with the Pennsylvania Line after the mutiny, he would have been dispersed among 3 provisional Pennsylvania battalions that were formed for service in the Southern Theater. That service, however, only included participation in the fighting at Green Spring, Virginia, and a small role in the siege at Yorktown. It did not include participation in the battles of Camden, Cowpens, or Eutaw Springs, all which Wallace claimed to have participated in. Moreover, no elements of the Pennsylvania Line were anywhere near South Carolina until after the siege of Yorktown. As previously noted, the biggest claim made by Wallace pertaining to his service during the Revolution was his momentous rescue of Lafayette on the battlefield at Brandywine. Fought 10 days after Wallace's enlistment in the 5th Pennsylvania, the Battle of Brandywine was an attempt made by General George Washington to prevent Sir William Howe's army from capturing Philadelphia. After arriving along the banks of the Brandywine River on September 9th, Washington began fortifying an approximately 8 to 10 mile stretch of the river at several crossing points known as forts, and the bulk of his defenses were located on the eastern heights of Chad's Ford, which was the major crossing point throughout those series of forts. To the north and south of Chad's Ford, Washington had also defended the several other crossing points that I just mentioned, but failed to guard two vital northern fords located approximately 6 miles north of Chad's Ford. The Crown Force leadership learned of this weakness and attempted to exploit it by setting out in two columns on the morning of the 11th. A small column marched east towards Chad's Ford to act as a feint and distract Washington, while the other, the bulk of the Crown forces, marched north to cross the two unguarded fords and slip behind the American line. Together, the two columns would then attempt to converge from the front and rear of the American position and force Washington's surrender. By the time of September 11th, 1777, the Marquis de Lafayette had only just arrived in America on June 13th, met the American commander-in-chief for the first time on August 5th, and turned 20 years old, on September 6th. Although he was a novice in the Revolution, he was still recognized as an important asset to the American cause, and Washington was under strict orders from Congress to not let anything happen to this young tool of Franco-American diplomacy. Like Wallace, Brandywine was also the first battle for Lafayette. And though the Frenchman received a commission from Congress as a major general in the Continental Army, it was only an honorary one. He commanded no troops during the engagement and remained close to Washington and his entourage throughout the battle's early stages. Upon receiving intelligence that he had been outflanked at the two unguarded fords, Washington quickly dispatched three American divisions under Generals John Sullivan, William Alexander, also known as Lord Sterling, and Adam Stephen to Birmingham Hill, a piece of high ground that was 3 miles northeast of the Army's position at Chad's Ford. After riding north to assess the situation, Washington and his entourage, that included Lafayette, arrived at a scene of chaos. In 1825, Lafayette, referring to himself in the third person, recalled what transpired after their arrival. He said, quote, the left wing, and he's referring to the portion of the army at Chad's Ford, remaining in a state of tranquility, and the right appearing fated to receive all the heavy blows, he obtained permission to join Sullivan. At his arrival, which seemed to inspirit the troops, he found that the corps of Sullivan scarcely had time to form itself on a line in front of the thinly wooded forest. A few moments later, Lord Cornwallis, in the finest order, advancing across the plain, his first line opened a brisk fire of musketry and artillery. The Americans returned the fire and did much injury to the enemy, but their right and left wings having given way, the generals and several officers joined the central division, in which were Marquis de Lafayette and Sterling. The enemy united all his fire upon the center. The confusion became extreme, and it was while Marquis de Lafayette was rallying the troops that a ball passed through his leg. Now, was it Andrew Wallace who assisted after this occurred? As Andrew Wallace was in the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment, a regiment that was part of General Anthony Wayne's division, his experience at Brandywine would have taken place around the vicinity of Chad's Ford, approximately 3 miles away from where Lafayette received his wound. There were Pennsylvania regiments in Sterling's division on Birmingham Hill, but the 5th Pennsylvania was not one of them. The only person Lafayette credited for providing aid was a fellow French officer and his aide-de-camp, Major Jamat. Lafayette, again in the third person, indicating that he was indebted to Jamat for the happiness of getting on his horse. In reality, though, it is highly probable that it took more than one man to put Lafayette on a horse. Moreover, Lafayette indicates that extreme confusion took place. This description, the nature of the action, and the fact that he had just been wounded all could have easily hindered Lafayette's ability to fully ascertain what was transpiring when the incident occurred. Due to a lack of sufficient evidence and documentation, we will probably never know exactly who, besides his aide-de-camp, if anyone, assisted Lafayette after he was wounded. If others joined his aide-de-camp, it certainly wasn't Andrew Wallace of the 5th Pennsylvania. There is, however, some interesting information that I recently uncovered while researching for today's presentation. During the action atop Birmingham Hill, General Sullivan's division, a little behind on the slides, excuse me, General Sullivan's division was to General Sterling's left. To Sterling's right was General Stevens' division, consisting of the 3rd and 4th Virginia brigades. Among the 4th Brigade, commanded by General Charles Scott, was the 4th, 8th, and 12th Virginia regiments, along with other additional troops. The 4th Brigade formed the left of Stevens' division and would have been adjacent to the right of Sterling's division. Both were formed near the location where Lafayette was claimed to have been wounded, circled here in red. Coincidentally enough, one of the company commanders of the 8th Virginia was a Captain Andrew Wallace. And given the position of the 8th Virginia up top Birmingham Hill, Captain Wallace would have been in very close proximity to Lafayette when he was wounded. This would have at least put one Andrew Wallace in a position to render potential aid to the marquis. Upon further investigation, Captain Andrew Wallace enlisted in the Continental Army in 1776, served at Brandywine and the rest of the Philadelphia campaign, excluding Paoli. And like Private Wallace, he was also at Valley Forge, served at Monmouth, and was located at the same encampments as Private Wallace through late 1779. It was at that time that elements of the Virginia line, unlike the Pennsylvania line, were sent to fight in the Southern campaign. Captain Andrew Wallace was among them. In late 1779, 3 newly organized Virginia battalions were sent south to recruit, draw weapons and equipment, and eventually make their way to Charleston, South Carolina, to support the American forces in their defense of the city. When the city fell to the British in May 1780, only 2 of these 3 Virginia battalions had made it to Charleston and soon after became prisoners of war. The 3rd Battalion, commanded by Colonel Abraham Buford, eluded capture, but it did not make it to Charleston due to various delays. Instead, it was intercepted by Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton and his British Legion at the Waxhaws. Buford and most of his forces were completely overwhelmed and almost virtually wiped out, but one company did manage to escape, and that company was commanded by Captain Andrew Wallace, who later joined up with the Continental forces in the South. Captain Wallace and his company went on to play an instrumental role at the Battle of Cowpens, forming the extreme right of the American Third Line. It was Captain Wallace who maneuvered his company and refused the American flank, which allowed General William Washington's cavalry to land a decisive blow against Bannister Tarleton's forces and achieve an American victory. Unfortunately, Captain Wallace was killed at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, where he and his Virginians also fought bravely. Although Captain Andrew Wallace did not serve at the Battle of Three Rivers in 76 and the Battle of Paoli in 77, nor the battles of Eutaw Springs and Yorktown in 1781, he participated in many of the same battles and served with the same officers that Private Andrew Wallace claimed to have served in and under, but would have never been close to or associated with. From his wartime service, Captain Wallace likely would have been more well known than Private Wallace, as he was an officer known to have served with distinction. Furthermore, the Virginia and Pennsylvania lines moved together frequently while in the Northern Theater. They also encamped at the same locations until 1779, sometimes directly next to each other. Because he was positioned so closely to Lafayette at Brandywine, Captain Andrew Wallace of the 8th Virginia could have easily even rendered aid to the Frenchmen. Could this be a case of confusion between the two Wallaces, resulting in their wartime careers becoming intertwined? In the decades following the Revolution, it could have been very easy for such confusion to occur, especially since Captain Wallace died during the war. If this confusion did occur, perhaps Private Wallace of the 5th Pennsylvania just simply accepted and went with it. Of course, this is all circumstantial and speculation, but it can't be completely ruled out. Little is known about Private Wallace's alleged military career after the Revolution, and I did not investigate it further to prove or disprove it, though documentation does support Wallace's claimed discharge on account of disability in 1811, not 1813, as he claimed. The extent of the disability that warranted the discharge is not documented, but Wallace returned to Chester County, Pennsylvania, and was granted an invalid pension. Upon his return to Pennsylvania, it appears that Wallace fell into hard times. Among the records contained within the Chester County archives are the admissions records for Chester County's poorhouse, an institution established in 1798 to provide shelter, employment, and other means of support for the poor living within the county. For nearly a decade, Andrew Wallace was recorded as residing at the Chester County poorhouse. And when cross-referencing the poorhouse and other county records with his invalid pension records, one can gain an understanding of Wallace's whereabouts from at least 1815 onward. From 1815 to 1821, again, Wallace was listed as a resident at the Chester County poorhouse with only one wife, not 5 others, as he so claimed to Nagel. Documentation also shows that Wallace moved and transferred his pension from Pennsylvania to Ohio in 1821, from Ohio to Kentucky in 1822, and back to Pennsylvania when he returned to the Chester County poorhouse in 1823. His last recorded year as a resident in the Chester County poorhouse was in 1824. After his final departure from the poorhouse, he briefly moved to Delaware and requested a pension transfer there, before moving back to Pennsylvania and requesting another transfer there in 1826. For the rest of his life, after 1826, Wallace resided in Upper Oxford Township in Chester County. So, with such an embellished service record and impoverished lifestyle, how did Wallace rise to such fame and popularity during the latter years of his life? Well, beginning in the late 18 teens, a new public interest surrounding the revolutionary generation rapidly began to fester. From the closing of the Revolution through the War of 1812, Continental Army veterans were surprisingly not appreciated by their fellow American citizens. As one historian indicates, they were seen as being the, quote, dregs of society, end quote. Many saw those who served in the Continental Army as men or teenage boys that didn't have any families or jobs and who lacked respectable attachment to their communities. Andrew Wallace was a prime example of this. Following a rise in nationalism after the War of 1812, however, Revolutionary War veterans began to receive the appreciation they were due. This appreciation, compounded with an extra stockpile of cash in the federal budget, resulted in the first pension legislation by Congress in 1818. Known as the Pension Act of 1818, the act called for pensions being issued to veterans who served at least 9 months in the Continental Army or Navy or until the end of the war. This did not include militia, however, and payouts were based solely on destitution and financial need. Congress was not prepared for the onslaught of applications they received after the passing of this act. Overwhelmed by the underestimated and under-budgeted number of applications, the coffers were bled at an alarming rate. To add insult to injury, the country was rapidly thrown into a recession shortly after, with the Great Panic of 1819, which occurred a year later. Finally, many veterans were also accused of falsifying their destitution to receive a payout, causing Congress to really rethink the pension process and the eligibility requirements. So on May 1st, 1820, Congress added a new eligibility requirement, saying that from that point on, veterans had to submit certification of estimate of estate and income, resulting in thousands of veterans being dropped from the eligibility list and sparking intense debates in Congress and throughout the American public. President John Quincy Adams, an advocate for veterans, deemed them, quote, venerable relics of an age gone by, and urged Congress to treat them with dignity. To Adams, many veterans that were truly in need of relief provided by a pension were either unable to provide the required evidence or just simply too ashamed to show their destitution. And as a result of these new eligibility records, veterans who were among the least deserving remained on the eligibility list, while others who truly needed it were dropped. The status of the Pension Act and its eligibility requirements became a debated stalemate throughout the rest of the 1820s. When Andrew Jackson assumed the presidency in 1829, he conducted a re-examination of the pension system. New pension legislation was finally passed in 1832, which included pensions for all veterans, both of the Continental Army and Navy and militia, no matter what their financial status was. Due to the former eligibility requirements, Andrew Wallace probably couldn't provide the required documentation and or was unfairly dropped from the eligibility list before 1832, hence his filing in 1833. Pro-veteran sentiments fueled by the debates were augmented by another momentous occasion in the 1820s. In 1824 and 1825, at the invitation of James Monroe, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States and conducted a 13-month-long tour of his adoptive homeland. The tour was not just designated to celebrate the French hero of the Revolution, but was also intended to be a kickoff for the celebrations surrounding the 50th anniversary of American independence and the veterans that helped achieve it. At every stop throughout Lafayette's tour, Revolutionary War veterans came out of the woodworks and were hailed as heroes alongside Lafayette. The tour and the 50th anniversary celebrations helped spark the public's imaginations for the war and perpetuated widespread appreciation and reverence for the Americans who fought it. It is probably for this reason that Wallace never returned to the Chester County poorhouse after 1824. The same year, Lafayette returned for his tour. To America's nationalistic public, Wallace and his fellow veterans of the Revolutionary generation were the last of a dying breed, and Wallace really began to ride the ever-growing wave of increasingly pro-veteran United States. Lafayette and his tour successfully transformed Wallace and his fellow veterans from the, quote, dregs of society to venerated heroes. When Wallace finally filed his pension on March 29th, 1833, in Washington, D.C., the War Department, like us, was a little skeptical of his claimed service, as he was only issued $120 per annum for only 2 years of service. That day, he had a very interesting encounter with former President John Quincy Adams on the streets of the nation's capital, and Adams actually recalled this encounter in his diary later on. Adams wrote, quote, "I was returning home. I met a man named Andrew Wallace who was coming to see me and came. He said he was 103 years of age, the 26th of this month. A Scot born, descended from Robert, a brother of Sir William Wallace. He was at the battles of Prestonpans and Culloden, a soldier of Prince Charles Edward. Fled first to Ireland, thence in 1752 to this country. Served in our army in 1776 till it was disbanded. Re-enlisted in 1786 and continued as a sergeant major in the Army till 1813, then discharged at 83. Lives at Westchester, Pennsylvania, and comes to solicit an increase in pension. What a life and survival of chances." As Adams was known to be an advocate for veterans, Wallace probably felt robbed by the War Department's decision to honor only 2 years of service and was seeking help from a potential ally. Notwithstanding the skepticism surrounding his claimed service during the Revolution, Andrew Wallace capitalized on his claimed service. After his encounter with Adams, pictured here on the right, after his encounter with Adams and before departing Washington, D.C., a benefit concert was held in Wallace's honor. Attendees included the public and other notable officials that even included President Andrew Jackson, who helped add to Wallace's celebrity status. The National Gazette in Philadelphia reported that the benefit was held to provide Wallace with, quote, the comforts of his journey home. His journey home was on a steamer from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and coincidentally enough, John Quincy Adams was on that same steamer and had another encounter with Wallace. On April 12th, Adams wrote of his second encounter with Wallace, noting that Wallace had again discussed his participation at the battles of Prestonpans and Culloden, and that, quote, a collection of a few dollars was made for the old man among the passengers. In September 1833, the National Gazette reported that Wallace had, quote, walked 50 miles in a few days to this city to assist in selling a portrait of himself, which has been lithographed by Messrs. Fenderick and Wilde. It is a close likeness and costs but $0.25. The firm referred to in the National Gazette, Fenderick and Wilde, was operated by artists and engravers Charles Fenderick and John Casper Wilde, who, like John Nagle, wanted to support Wallace and advocate for veterans, and they published this lithogram soon after. Another lithograph, thought to be produced in 1833 by Thomas Birch, a friend of John Nagle, shows Wallace wearing Masonic regalia with the line, quote, "Rescuer of Lafayette at Brandywine." Wallace's fame wasn't just from illustrations, though. He was also a spectacle at various events and attractions where people could come and greet the veteran and listen to his story. From venues that ranged from various common boarding homes to Peale's Museum in Baltimore in 1834, Wallace traveled around and dazzled spectators. Andrew Wallace unfortunately died in New York City on January 22nd, 1835, at the age of 105 years old. His funeral, held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, was attended by nearly 2,000 people, which included the city's mayor and members of the city council. It also included military honors and a Masonic funeral service. Even after death, Wallace was celebrated, and this lithogram, used as the cover of the sheet music entitled Ye Sons of Patriots Gone, which is thought to have been published in either 1835 or 1836. In both life and death, Wallace and his story won the hearts of the public imagination, and he was revered for it. We may never know how and why Andrew Wallace's military career during the Revolution became so illustrious and exaggerated. From all indications, it appears that it is a nice combination of personal embellishment, a confusion between characters and service records, as well as an extravagant tales that just snowballed from a rise in pro-veteran sentiments in America. Regardless, Andrew Wallace didn't deny any of it. Through his 1833 pension record or pension letter, one can clearly see that he embraced it all. But can you blame him? After serving in the Revolution and other alleged conflicts, he was abandoned by a seemingly ungrateful nation and forced to live in poverty. Today, this treatment towards veterans would be blasphemy, but it was an unfortunate norm for veterans after the Revolution and during most of Andrew Wallace's life. Wallace played a monumental role in countering that norm. Out of all the objects in our current exhibition that demonstrate the legacy of Lafayette's tour, I would argue that this portrait is one of the most important. Yes, in the exhibition, it is mainly described as being associated with Wallace's claim to have helped Lafayette on the battlefield and how much soldiers revered the French hero. But if we were hanging portraits of everyone who claimed to have rescued Lafayette at Brandywine, you would see their portraits all over the home here at Anderson House because there just simply wouldn't be enough room in the exhibition space. In fact, one could actually say that the Continental Army actually lost at Brandywine because so many people were too busy helping Lafayette according to their pensions. What makes this portrait so significant, however, is that it demonstrates what the tour did for veterans and Americans and how it sparked an overdue respect for those who fought to achieve independence and who were, for the longest times, thought to be second-rate citizens. Without Lafayette's tour of the American Republic, the story of Andrew Wallace, embellished or not, probably would have been lost forever in a poorhouse in Pennsylvania. Similarly, pro-veteran sympathizers like John Nagel probably wouldn't have cared so much about veterans like Andrew Wallace or Joseph Winter to advocate for them through the influence of his work. John Nagel's portrait of Andrew Wallace depicts a man and a veteran that suffered neglect and disrespect for much of the early 19th century, but it also represents a movement of progress and reform that helps solidify the importance of veterans like Wallace in the United States and implant a sense of reverence for them in the American psyche. This portrait serves as a reminder of the honor and dignity that we owe to our nation's veterans, no matter what their service record actually entailed. So with that, I thank you, and I will answer any questions.